Hi, this is Chapter 13 from A Boy at War by Harry Mazer. The launch was stalled. The coxswain, a stump of cigar in his mouth, was frantically working on the engine. "Hey, kid!" he shouted as Adam jumped in the boat. "Give me that wrench!" It was as if he'd been waiting for Adam. Not for who he really was, but for who they thought he was, a sailor. And maybe he was a sailor, at least for now. Whatever he wasn't what he'd been that morning. The launch crew worked on the engine. The boat was sitting directly under a massive anchor that shook every time a bomb fell. Finally, the engine started and they moved away, looking for survivors. As they passed port side to the overturned Oklahoma, a man escaped from underwater in a porthole, and he shot to the surface like a seal, hair slicked back, eyes huge. He wouldn't get into the boat, but was dog paddling, kept turning to his ship, saying his mates were down there and he'd wait for them. Berman, the coxswain, cut the throttle and sat there talking to the guy. Nobody else came out of the ship, but the man still wouldn't get in the launch, and they left him. The harbor was dotted with small boats picking up men who had leaped from the burning ships. Oil was everywhere, tar-like floating islands on the surface of the water. Adam worked alongside Rinaldi, the sailor who had pulled him into the launch. He was a cocky fireplug of a guy. He'd point to someone in the water, and when they'd throw out lines or a life buoy or one of the long boat hooks, the men came out of the water black with oil, sometimes only their eyes showing. Adam looked at each man. Each one of them could have been his father. Some men refused help and swam toward shore. Some men they brought to the boat were burned so badly they could barely be touched. Adam reached to help a man into a boat, and skin came off in his hand. He gagged, then vomited over the side. Ashamed, he looked at Rinaldi. "Oh, that's all right, buddy," Rinaldi said. Men flopped and twisted on the deck, barely able to speak. A man with a terrible wound in his side kept thanking them and telling them that he had to get back to the ship. Berman never stopped chewing on an unlit cigar, and he never stopped cursing. First he cursed the Japs, then he cursed the Americans. The admirals and generals and high commanders. Why hadn't they known the attack was coming? How did they let this happen? Where was the admiral? What, sitting on his fanny drinking tea? Get him over here. Let him see this. He'd like to stick his face in it. One man with a huge tattooed arms hung on the edge of the boat. His face was black with oil. "Boys," he said, and he was looking at Adam, nodding at him as if he knew him. "You're good boys," he said. And then he just slid away under the water, went down, and didn't come up. Nothing in Adam's life had prepared him for any of this. Not for the maimed, not for the wounded, not for the dead they left floating in the water. He'd read about war. He'd imagined himself in war, but never like this. War was a fight between equals. It was clean. It was fair. The best man won. But this, what was it? There were no words that he'd ever learned, no book that he'd ever read that had prepared him for this. What was it? It was stink and blood and dying. When the launch couldn't hold any more survivors, they headed for the docks. At Fort Island, the men who could walked off. The others were carried off on stretchers. The Naval Air Station was wrecked. The hangars burned down to the girders. Every one of the PBYs that Adam had always thought looked like flying dolphins had been hit and were strewn like trash across the field. Survivors kept coming off the boats and crawling out of the water. They were in rags. They were naked. They were covered with oil. Rinaldi was guiding a man who had been blinded by oil. Adam ran ahead to find a medic. The medics were running from man to man. Adam finally got one to stop. The medic pointed to a building on the other side of the field. Well, if your man can walk, take him there. They were almost to the emergency hospital when the warning siren wailed. The three of them dropped down behind a wall. Near them, sailors were pulling machine guns out of a wrecked plane and setting them up. The siren kept wailing, but no planes came, no bombs fell. Well, come on, let's move on, buddy, Rinaldi said. The emergency hospital had been set up in a mess hall, a big open room. The wounded were lying everywhere, on tables and on the floor. The dead were stacked up under a window. Adam walked through the room, looking at each man, looking for his father. The wounded called out to him for water. He found a sink and filled Dixie cups. Just glad for something to do.